SoroBuild Dev Studio is now live, and in this video, I'll be doing a quick demo on how to use SoroBuild Dev Studio to deploy and interact with smart contracts. Before we get into the demo, what is SoroBuild? SoroBuild is a developer platform that gives builders, developers, and projects the tools to build, test, deploy, and interact with smart contracts on Soroban, faster and more easily. And it doesn't stop there. SoroBuild also includes tools for classic Stellar interactions as well. SoroBuild has two main features. The first is the Dev Studio, a simple UI-based platform where users can deploy smart contracts, interact with smart contracts, and work with useful blockchain tools through an almost no-code experience. To access it, just go to soro.build and click Open Dev Studio. Once you do that, you'll see the Studio interface, with different tabs for different functions. The second feature is the full online IDE. At the moment, it is still in development. But what we're building is a Soroban-focused IDE, inspired by the kind of workflow developers already know from tools like Remix. It is being designed to support full development workflows, including multi-file project development, testing, debugging, deployment, and auditing. But for today, this demo will focus on the Studio. So this is the Studio interface. One of the tabs here is Invoke Contract. What that means is, you can load an existing contract and interact with its functions. Before I go further, I want to emphasize that this tool currently supports both testnet and mainnet. Since SoroBuild is both a developer tool and a deployment tool, it supports development environments and production environments. Now, since I'm going to be demonstrating deployment, I'll go to the Deploy Contract tab. To deploy a contract, all you need to do is upload your WASM file. That means your contract should already be compiled before uploading it here. For this demo, I'll be using one of the Soroban token contract examples. The first version I'll show is a modified version that uses an init function instead of a constructor. That means I can deploy the contract first and initialize it later, without supplying constructor arguments during deployment. So let's begin with that one. The first thing I'll do is connect my wallet. You can connect with wallets like Freighter, Albedo, and others. For this demo, I'll use Freighter. I already have testnet selected in my wallet, so the Studio pre-selects that network for me. Now to deploy, I load the WASM file. I'll select the version of the token contract that uses init instead of a constructor. Once the file is loaded, I simply click Proceed. At this point, I'll be asked to approve two transactions. The first transaction uploads the contract code, or WASM, to the blockchain. The second transaction creates the contract instance itself. The contract has been created successfully. You can see the contract ID here, and you can copy it and open it in the Explorer to inspect it. Now let's go back into the Studio. If I want to interact with this contract, I can either copy the contract ID and paste it into the Invoke Contract tab, or I can simply click to load it directly. And as you can see, all the functions defined in the contract are now available. So the first thing I want to do is call the init function. One useful thing about SoroBuild Studio is that it gives you two ways to pass arguments when interacting with contracts. You can use the form-based input or the script-based input. Let's start with the form. In this case, I'll set my wallet address as the admin. Then I'll enter the decimals. Then the token name, SoroBuild Demo. And finally, the symbol, SOD. Once everything is filled in, I click Submit, approve the transaction, and wait a moment. Now the invocation is successful. You can see the success response here, and you can also open the transaction in the Explorer to verify it. From here, I can also test read functions. For example, I can call the name function to read back the token name that was set during initialization. Now let's move on to the second case, deploying a contract that requires constructor arguments. This time, I'm using the original token contract, the one that has a constructor instead of an init function. Since this contract requires constructor arguments, those arguments must be supplied during deployment. SoroBuild Dev Studio gives you two ways to do that. The first method is the form method. With the form method, you manually specify how many constructor arguments the contract needs, then define their types and values. In this example, the constructor takes 4 arguments. The first is the admin, which is an address. The second is decimals, which is a U32. The third is the name, which is a string, and the fourth is the symbol, which is also a string. The second method is the script method. This method is especially useful when the constructor arguments are more complex, or when you want more flexibility. The script input allows builders to define arguments programmatically. By default, helper utilities such as native to scval, address, asset, and operation are already exposed in the editor environment, so you do not need to import them again. If you try to redeclare them, the editor will show an error, because they already exist in scope. But if you need something else from the SDK that is not already exposed by default, you can still access it from the Stellar SDK object available in the editor. Now let me define the constructor arguments. For admin, I'll use my wallet address. For decimals, I'll use 7. For the token name, I'll use SoroDemo. And for the symbol, I'll use SDM. You can click Preview to validate the script before submitting. If there is a type error, or if one of the values is not accepted, the preview should help point that out. Of course, there can still be edge cases, and we'll continue improving that based on feedback and usage. Now that everything looks good, I'll click Submit. Just like before, there are 2 approvals. The first approval uploads the contract WASM. The second approval creates the contract instance. And now the contract has been deployed successfully. You can copy the contract ID or simply click Invoke to load it immediately into the Invoke Contract tab. Once loaded, all available contract functions appear again. Since I set myself as the admin during deployment, I can now call admin-only functions like mint. The Studio already understands the contract spec, so it knows the number of arguments required, the expected types, and how to render those inputs. So for mint, I'll enter my address as the recipient, and then I'll mint 1,000 tokens. Then I click Submit, approve the transaction, and wait a moment. And there it is, success. You can also open the transaction in the Explorer and inspect the details there. That covers the core process of deploying and interacting with a contract. But one important thing to note is this: you do not have to deploy a contract in order to interact with it. You can load any existing contract as long as you are connected to the correct network. For example, if you try to load a mainnet contract while your wallet is still connected to testnet, the Studio may not resolve it correctly, and it may show a warning. That does not necessarily mean the contract does not exist. It can simply mean that the selected network is wrong. Once you switch to the correct network, you can load the contract and interact with it normally. Now, beyond contract deployment and invocation, SoroBuild also includes tools for classic Stellar asset interactions. For example, you can do things like change trust lines, send payments, and work with other asset-related operations. That said, the Transaction Builder is the more flexible option. Why? Because with the Transaction Builder, you can chain multiple operations together inside one transaction. So instead of using separate tools for simple actions, you can build a custom transaction flow in one place. For example, you could create a payment operation and then add another operation, like a sell offer, all in the same transaction. For native XLM, the Studio already recognizes the asset automatically. For issued assets, you provide the asset code and the issuer address. If invalid input is entered, such as using a contract address where an issuer address is expected, that should ideally be handled gracefully, and we are continuing to improve those cases. So overall, SoroBuild Dev Studio gives you a streamlined way to deploy contracts, interact with contracts, and build classic Stellar transactions, all from one interface. And this is only the beginning. We're still improving the Studio, and the full IDE is also on the way. So that's the demo for now. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.